A janitor stopped to fix a broken piano in an empty hotel lobby. He had no idea the woman watching from the stairs owned the entire building, and that his 15 minutes of kindness were about to save her company and change both of their lives forever. Stay until the end, because the twist in this story is something almost nobody sees coming. Marcus mopped floors at the Ashford Grand every night from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Nobody in that hotel knew his name. To the guests, he was just a grey uniform pushing a cart past the marble columns, someone they stepped around without a second glance. He didn't mind being invisible. Invisible people don't get blamed when things go wrong. That's what 11 years of hard luck had taught him. Marcus had once had a different life. He had studied music in college, dreamed of performing in concert halls, until his father got sick and the medical bills swallowed everything he'd saved. He dropped out to work 2 jobs. Then his father died anyway, and the dream died with him. Since then, Marcus told himself that dreaming was a luxury for people who could afford to fail. He worked nights, slept days, and kept his head down, and that was enough. Or at least he had convinced himself it was. One night, past midnight, he heard something strange coming from the grand ballroom. A piano playing itself badly. One note stuck, striking over and over like a broken heartbeat, echoing through the empty hall. He should have kept walking. His job was floors, not furniture, and the ballroom wasn't even on his list for the night. But something about that broken note pulled at him, the same way an old wound aches before a storm. He opened the door anyway. A grand piano sat alone under a dust sheet in the middle of the ballroom. Key A4 jammed flat, striking the same dull thud every time the air conditioning vibrated the floor. Marcus set down his cart and lifted the lid, and for a moment he just stood there, staring at the keys like they belonged to a life he'd left behind. Then he did what his father, a piano tuner who'd died broke and unknown, had taught him before Marcus was even old enough to read sheet music. He worked in silence for 20 minutes, loosening the sticking key, cleaning the felt, retuning 2 strings by ear, the way his father used to hum while he worked. When he finally pressed A4 again, it rang out clean and warm, and for the first time in years, Marcus smiled without meaning to. "You play?" a voice asked from the shadows. Marcus turned fast, his heart jumping, expecting a manager, a write-up, maybe worse. Instead, he found a woman in a plain coat, sitting alone on the ballroom steps, a cup of vending machine coffee cooling in her hands. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her eyes tired in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. "Used to," Marcus said carefully, bracing for trouble. "My dad taught me before he passed. I just didn't want to hear it broken all night." She studied him for a long moment, then smiled, the first real smile she'd worn in a long time, it seemed, and asked if he'd play something. Just one song. He hesitated. It had been years, but something in her voice sounded like someone who needed proof that beautiful things still existed. So he sat down, still in his uniform, and let his hands remember what his heart had tried to forget. He played an old, simple piece his father used to play every evening after work. Nothing fancy, just honest. When he finished, the woman didn't clap. She sat perfectly still, and for a second Marcus thought he'd done something wrong. Then she said quietly, "Thank you. I needed that more than you know," and stood, and walked out of the ballroom before he could even ask her name. Marcus went back to mopping, telling himself it meant nothing, just a strange, quiet moment between 2 strangers, passing through the same lonely hour of the night. He didn't expect to think about it again. He was wrong. 3 days later, Marcus was called into the general manager's office, the kind of call that usually meant termination, the kind that made his stomach drop the whole elevator ride up. He ran through everything he might have done wrong, and came up empty, which somehow made it worse. Instead, the manager stood the moment Marcus walked in, and there was something strange in his expression, not anger but disbelief. "Do you know who you spoke to in the ballroom Tuesday night?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "That was Eleanor Voss. She owns the Ashford Grand and 40 other properties across the country." For a moment, Marcus couldn't speak. He thought back to the tired woman in the plain coat, the cheap coffee, The way she'd sat alone in the dark like she had nowhere else to be, and none of it matched the name he'd just heard. Eleanor, it turned out, had flown in that week to quietly decide whether to sell the hotel and lay off its staff. The board had been pushing for it for months, arguing the property was old, inefficient, a relic not worth saving in a portfolio built for growth. She had come alone without her usual assistants to walk the halls one last time before signing away her father's legacy, the same father who had taught her to play that very piano years before he ever built his first hotel with nothing but a tool belt and a stubborn refusal to quit. She hadn't planned on staying that night. She certainly hadn't planned on hearing that old song again, played by a stranger in a grey uniform who had no idea what it meant to her or what it would end up meaning. For the 200 employees whose jobs quietly hung in the balance of her decision. What Marcus didn't know was that Eleanor had already drafted the papers to close the deal. She had a meeting scheduled with the board that very week to sign off on the sale. But something about that night in the ballroom stayed with her. The sound of a stranger caring enough to fix a broken key nobody had asked him to fix, simply because he couldn't stand to hear it suffer through another night. It reminded her of her father, of why he'd built the place at all, not as an asset, but as somewhere people could feel looked after. She cancelled the meeting the next morning. The board was furious. They called it sentimental, reckless, bad business. Eleanor listened to every objection, and then told them the decision was already made. Eleanor didn't sell the hotel. She restructured it instead and personally asked Marcus to run a new initiative she was building from the ground up, hiring and training staff from local shelters and re-entry programs, people the industry usually looked straight through, the same way almost everyone had once looked through him. Marcus almost said no. He didn't think of himself as someone who led anything, but Eleanor told him something he never forgot, that the people who notice a broken key, nobody else even hears, are exactly the people who should be trusted to lead. Marcus still fixes things. Now he also builds them, programs, second chances, careers for people the world had quietly written off, the way he almost had been. He tells his team the same thing every single week, that you don't have to be seen to matter, and that sometimes the smallest kindness you never think twice about is the exact thing someone else has been quietly praying for. Years later, Marcus keeps an old, worn photograph of his father in his office, right next to a small plaque that reads simply, "Fix what others walk past." He still plays that ballroom piano sometimes, late at night when the hotel is quiet, and every time, without fail, he thinks of a tired woman in a plain coat who once needed nothing more than 15 minutes and an honest song to remember, that the world could still be kind. And here's the lesson at the heart of Marcus and Eleanor's story, the one worth carrying with you long after this video ends. Kindness is rarely convenient. It shows up at midnight in an empty ballroom when there's no audience and nothing to gain from it. Marcus didn't fix that piano because he expected a reward. He fixed it because walking past something broken, when he had the power to repair it, felt wrong to him. That's the real lesson. That character is what you do when nobody is watching and nobody will ever find out. The world rewards loud achievements, but it's built quietly, by people who do the right thing in empty rooms. So the next time you notice something small you could fix, a kind word you could say, a person you could simply listen to without expecting anything back, don't wait for the perfect moment or the right audience. You never know whose life is hanging on that one small act of decency. Sometimes the smallest, most unnoticed choice you make is the exact turning point someone else has been quietly waiting for. If this story moved you, hit like, share it with someone who still believes small acts of kindness ripple further than we know, and subscribe for more real stories of hope, courage, and second chances. Drop "Kindness Still Matters" in the comments if you believe one quiet moment can change two lives at once. Because Marcus never set out to save anything. He just didn't want to hear a broken piano.